Let us begin our story with a small video games company, a company that actually revolutionized the video game industry spanning over 2 decades. Well, judging by the title of this video, we all know who this is actually going to be about. So now let us begin at the very beginning. We need to go back to 1982 with Tim and Chris Stamper, who started a very small video games company called Ashby Computers and Graphics, which would later become Ultimate Play the Game. One of the first games they released was Jetpack. The game was so popular, over 1/3 of ZX Spectrum owners had a copy of the game. They continued working 18 hours a day on titles like Trans Am, Cookie, and Saberwolf. Although most titles were released multi-platform, they were best known for their work on the ZX Spectrum home computer. In 1984, Tim and Chris discovered the Famicom, which outside of Japan, we all know as the Nintendo Entertainment System, and was designed by none other than Nintendo. The system drew in the attention of Tim and Chris. At this time, they made a subdivision of their company, which had the codename of Rare. With the intention of fully breaking the code for the Famicom, and wanting to learn as much about the games and the system as possible, come 1985, Tim and Chris sold Ultimate Play the Game to US Gold. They realised the home computer market would be irrelevant in a few years. So Tim and Chris travelled to Japan talk with the Big N about developing games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Nintendo gave Rare an unlimited budget and were allowed to make as many games as they saw fit. Whilst they were producing games for the NES, they started producing games at a rate of at least 1 per month, with games such as Jeopardy and Battletoads. And as time went on, they also developed games for the Sega Mega Drive, the Sega Game Gear, and the Nintendo Game Boy. And at this point, Rare had acquired a steady flow of money by the time the Super Nintendo rolled around, at which point they bought Silicon Graphics. This then propelled them to being one of the most graphically and technically advanced gaming developers in the world. And at this point, with their new 3D rendered graphics, Nintendo saw them as a valuable asset and bought 49% of the company, thus making Rare a second-party developer for Nintendo. Nintendo then gave Rare any IP to work with, from Mario to Yoshi to Donkey Kong. And of course, Rare chose Donkey Kong. By the time 1994 rolls around, Donkey Kong Country was released to the public and the game was a critically and commercially successful game. It went on to become the 3rd best-selling game on the Super Nintendo, with just over 9 million units sold. Rare also developed 2 sequels to Donkey Kong Country. Rare was also seeing success in the arcades at the time with the game Killer Instinct. And at this point in time, Rare was producing nothing but gold for Nintendo. And by the time the Nintendo 64 rolled around, there was no stopping Rare. Although their first outing on the Nintendo 64 was Blast Corps. In 1995, Nintendo obtained the license for the new James Bond movie. They handed the license over to Rare. The game originally started as an on-rails shooter. It gradually became what we know as the first-person shooter. And this game, single-handedly, revolutionized the video game industry, with all new game features, such as objectives, headshots, and a legendary 4-player split-screen mode. The game was released in 1997, 2 years after the movie came out. It went on to become a critical and a commercial success. It then went on to become the 3rd best-selling video game on the Nintendo 64, with over 8 million units sold. Whilst fans were eagerly awaiting the next big Rare IP, which at the time was Banjo-Kazooie, Rare developed and released Diddy Kong Racing. Banjo-Kazooie was Rare's interpretation of Mario 64. It was released to critical acclaim, and Banjo-Kazooie also received a sequel a few years later. At this point, the Stamper brothers went back to the first-person shooting genre. But they didn't want to make another James Bond game, so they created Perfect Dark. Although receiving good reviews, it was nowhere near as popular as GoldenEye. Following the release of Perfect Dark, Rare proceeded to make a game based on the IP Conker the Squirrel, originally conceived as a light-hearted 3D platformer, but it slowly developed, over time, into the adventure about a squirrel with a hangover. Receiving an M for mature and the critics raving about it did not sell well. Thus, Nintendo decided to disown Conker the Squirrel, and it was also one of the last games actually released for the Nintendo 64. In the year 2000, Microsoft started development on their new home console, the Xbox, and they had their sights locked on at the talent at Rare. Microsoft proceeded to purchase Rare for $177 million, thus making them a first-party developer. At this point, Rare had finished development on their last second-party title for the Nintendo GameCube. Originally titled Dinosaur Planet for the Nintendo 64, the game was reworked into a Star Fox spin-off called Star Fox Adventures at Shigeru Miyamoto's request. At this point, a lot of key players had left the company to start their own video game companies, and none other are more iconic than Free Radical, who went on to create the Time Splitters series and Haze. The first game by Rare on Microsoft's new home console was grabbed by the Ghoulies, and Microsoft wasn't in the handheld console market, so Rare made a few handheld titles for the Game Boy Advance, such as Mr. Pants, Banjo Pilot, and Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. The last game Rare developed for the original Xbox was a remake of Conker's Bad Fur Day, now titled Conker Live and Reloaded. The game received excellent reviews upon its release. Rare was then given the chance to make 2 launch titles for the new Xbox 360. Instead of working on new titles, they took 2 of their back burner games for the release of the system, starting on Cameo Elements of Power, which originally started as a game for the Nintendo 64, then it moved towards the GameCube, then the original Xbox, and finally the Xbox 360. The game was liked by critics and sold well. The second title was a prequel to Perfect Dark, called Perfect Dark Zero. After the release of Viva Pinata in 2006, Tim and Chris left the company they'd built after almost 2 decades. After Tim and Chris had left the company, Rare began to work on a third Banjo-Kazooie game titled Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. In 2010, Rare started working on Kinect titles, such as Kinect Sports Season 1 and 2 and Kinect Sports Rivals. In September 2012, a group of former Rare employees announced their intent to create a spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie, whom later became Playtonic Games, and created a brand new IP in the same vein as Banjo-Kazooie titled Yooka-Laylee, which would later be released on Xbox One and PlayStation 4 on the 11th of April 2017, and then a Switch port following that December. Back to Rare. In 2014, Rare began development on its new game, which would later be announced in 2015, with the title of Sea of Thieves. At this point, Rare had 2 groups working on 2 games, one team working on Sea of Thieves and another on a compilation title of 30 games to celebrate the studio's 30th anniversary. Rare Replay was announced and released in 2015. Rare continued working on Sea of Thieves for the next 3 years until it was finally released on the 20th of March 2018, which upon release is a totally new approach to video games. As it's a live game, it's constantly being updated and having new content added for what seems to be the endless adventure the game has to offer, but still retaining that traditional Rare charm in its art and style.
In 2018, Rare announced 2 new games. Firstly, they announced a new Battletoads game that would incorporate the gameplay of the originals and a new 3-player couch co-op mode. The game is being developed by Dalila Studios. The second announcement was a brand new IP from Rare, which is called Everwild. Little is known at this moment in time what the gameplay will be, but it's still retaining that classic Rare art and style in its trailer. Hey guys, if you did like this video, please make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Remember to leave a like, and I'm going to see all of you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye!